Well, hey, everybody, I'm Sam. I am a student of the Bible. I'm a pastor. I've been a pastor for 22 years, and I'm a writer, and my training involves biblical studies, theology, and biblical languages. So one of the questions that I get asked when I talk about biblical scholarship and that kind of stuff is, and I make the comment of, well, this critical scholars think this, but even confessional scholars think this. The question inevitably comes up with, from people are like, okay, so what's the difference between those two, between a confessional or a critical scholar? And so I want to talk about that in this video, and I want to provide two disclaimers, okay? Disclaimer number one is I am not a Bible scholar, okay? I don't claim to be one. I often appeal to different kinds of biblical scholarship when I talk about things, but I am a pastor, and so I am my whole job is helping a congregation of people understand the scriptures and understand a relationship with Christ and that kind of stuff. Okay, so my job is not as a biblical scholar, although I'm very intrigued by all that stuff, and I've been trained at a decent level to do that. And I am actually in the middle of working on finishing up my schooling that I had to put on pause way back in the day, and eventually hopefully working towards a PhD and all that kind of stuff. So that's on the horizon happening. But I'm not a biblical scholar, so I won't, and I'm not pretending to be one. Number two, the second thing I want to say is that I'm going to talk about some things in generalities in this video. And there are going to be things that I'll say that aren't necessarily all the time, always the way it is. Okay. And so we just need to know that these are generally speaking like the things that separate these two. But there's all kinds of things in that mix. And so I'll kind of point that out in a couple of them. But so the question, what's the difference between a critical scholar and a confessional scholar? So the way I see it, there's probably a bunch of things, but I see really three main things that kind of pop out to me when I think about the difference between these two things. Okay, so number one, the first one is this: it's theological convictions versus methodological convictions. The difference between a confessional scholar and a critical scholar is that a confessional scholar, at the end of the day, with their scholarship, is governed by their theological convictions. And so as they're doing their scholarship, as they're doing research, finding things, what's going to govern them at the end of the day is going to be their theological convictions. And a critical scholar, what's going to govern their scholarship is going to be their methodological convictions. And so what a critical scholar will do is that they will, if they have theological convictions, if they're people of faith, they will lay those things aside and try really hard to not let those biases come into their scholarship. And they will just say, I'm going to use the historical critical method in my methodology of studying. My methodology of scholarship is going to govern how I do this, versus a confessional scholar at the end of the day. No matter what they find, their theological convictions are more than likely going to govern their scholarship. Like I said, these are generalities, they're not always true. So here's what that does not mean. It does not mean that a person who uses the historical critical method or a person who is a critical scholar is not a person of faith. That's not what that means. Because there are plenty of top critical scholars who are people of deep faith. They just allow their methodological convictions to govern how they do their scholarship, and they keep those things separate from their personal bias and personal faith. Whereas a confessional scholar would say, no, my theological convictions need to inform my scholarship, and they need to govern my scholarship. Which brings me to point number two. And point number two is this: is that confessional scholars, more often than not, I want to say almost all the time, like I said, this may be more of a generality, but more often than not, they have to sign a confession of faith wherever they're working, whether it's a university or something. There's usually a confession of faith that they have to sign off on and say that they'll adhere by those beliefs and that and what's going on there. A critical scholar doesn't have to sign any of that, and they don't have to even abide by any of that. They just can kind of they're free to play and write whatever they want to, as long as it holds to their methodological convictions. And so this is actually kind of a big deal for some critical scholars. And they would even, some critical scholars would even say that this is the big issue that's going on in the SBL. This is the big issue that's going on in the field of biblical scholarship, because they would say that the confessional scholars who have to sign a confession of faith and adhere to that confession of faith can't do real proper scholarship because their confession won't allow them to go all the way to the place that they need to go. And where the confessional scholar would say is, well, no, but my theology is the most important thing here. And it's what dictates, and this is a theological book, so we need to allow that to happen. And so there is this kind of a bigger thing. Actually, if you search on YouTube, there's some people who are like, we're ready to leave the SBL because it seems like there's more and more and more confessional scholars in the SBL nowadays, and they're kind of going, this is kind of, I don't want to say ruining their field for critical scholarship, but it's kind of like, they're saying, well, we can't do real critical scholarship because the confessional scholars are, their confessions are kind of muddying the water on that. But that is a big difference between these two, the confessional scholars versus the critical scholars. And now here's the deal: if I was jumping in, if I had my PhD and had the stamp of approval from a university, part of the SBL, all that kind of stuff, I probably would lean more towards the confessional side than the critical side. Here's the deal: I appreciate critical scholarship. I benefit from critical scholarship a lot, but there are certain things that I bring to the table that would lend it to be confessional scholarship, not critical scholarship. And so, it doesn't mean it's any less or any better or whatever. It's just a different way of approaching scholarship. And really what that leads to is the third point here, that each of these brings a different set of assumptions to their scholarship about the biblical text. And the assumptions that the confessional scholar brings to the text are going to be more confessional in nature. They're going to be more theological in nature. They're going to have certain presuppositions kind of in there, that they would say, hey, these are my governing principles. These are the things that I have to adhere to. Where the critical scholar says, well, I don't have to adhere to any of that kind of stuff, and I'm not going to adhere to any of that kind of stuff. But they also, a critical scholar brings their own assumptions into to this, but they're very different than the assumptions that the confessional scholar would bring. And so that's kind of the difference between those two. Like, one of the big differences between like a confessional scholar and a critical scholar is that a confessional scholar will often bring in the assumption of this text is divinely inspired by God, versus a critical scholar would say, well, we're going to set that aside. Even if they believe it. Here's the deal: even if they believe it, they'll be like, okay, well, let's set that aside for a second, and let's allow the methodology of historical critical methodology to kind of work, and let's see where the data drives us and leads us, versus us making an assumption that this is divinely inspired by God, therefore this kind of a deal. And so though that's kind of an example of some different kind of assumptions that lead to methodologies that lead to a very different place for a confessional scholar versus a critical scholar. There's probably a lot more than that I'm not saying here, but those are the three that like popped into my head as I was thinking about this, as I was actually having a conversation about this with somebody, and I was like, okay, this is kind of as I see it, some of the differences. I would love to hear if you have any other ones. You're like, no, this is another one, and this is another one. Throw those comments in the comment section. I would love to interact with you on that. And thanks for, if you're someone who's watching a lot, thanks for watching. Thanks for commenting. That's awesome. Like the video, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.